All of our narratives are created for the sole purpose of providing entertainment. Approximately 17 years ago, my life took an unexpected turn when I became involved in a complex situation. I became romantically involved with the wife of a pastor who owned a large Pentecostal megachurch. What made this situation even more complicated was the fact that she and I shared a dark secret. If this secret were to be exposed, it could potentially become headline news. Consequently, I had to exercise extreme caution and conceal the truth. Many details were required to avoid detection. My journey began when I was 16 years old, moving into yet another foster home. This was not the first time I had experienced this upheaval following my grandmother's passing. I had been shuffled from one foster home to another. Unfortunately, my mother had a severe drug problem, which had led to the state removing me from her custody shortly after my birth. They placed me with the closest responsible relative, who happened to be my maternal grandmother throughout my upbringing. I remained unaware of my father's identity. He could have been one of my mother's numerous boyfriends, but the truth remained a mystery. After my grandmother's passing, my mother was unable to reclaim me for two primary reasons. Firstly, her whereabouts were not easily traceable. Secondly, she continued to grapple with her pills obsession. Growing up in foster care proved to be a challenging journey. My maternal grandmother was my primary caretaker throughout my upbringing. I was unaware of my father's identity, as he could have been one of my mother's numerous boyfriends. However, the truth remained a mystery after my grandmother's passing. My mother was unable to reclaim me for two primary reasons. Firstly, her whereabouts were not easily traceable. Secondly, she continued to grapple with her pill addiction. Growing up in foster care proved to be a challenging journey. With each relocation to a new residence, I encountered a new set of challenges. However, I consistently made an effort to adapt to my changing circumstances. This resulted in my navigating the foster care system, which involved transitioning from one foster household to another. This time around, I ended up under the care of a couple in their early 50s, a married couple who had previously raised their own children, all of whom had grown up and moved out of their residence. It was a spacious 5-bedroom house. The couple, who had previously raised their own children, accommodated approximately 7 children in their home. In contrast to my previous experiences, they approached foster care with a unique perspective. They maintained a disciplined and professional demeanor, treating foster parenting more like a business endeavor. Although they occasionally displayed compassion, their approach was rooted in pragmatism. They refrained from forming strong attachments, recognizing that children often came and went in their household. This dynamic was markedly different from what I had grown accustomed to living with them. The lifestyle I had become accustomed to living with them presented a number of challenges. Their home was well organized and governed by a set of strict rules. They ran a tight ship, ensuring that everyone carried out their assigned chores and fulfilled their responsibilities. On occasion, it felt as though I was residing in a structured environment rather than a nurturing home filled with warmth and emotional attachment. Nevertheless, life continued, and I made an earnest effort to adapt to the established routines and regulations. I strove to integrate into this new environment. At the age of 16, I found myself as the eldest among the 7 boys residing in the foster home. The couple had devised a distinctive strategy aimed at maximizing their financial resources. Instead of expending funds on groceries, they directed us to seek assistance from soup kitchens and weekly pantries to procure our essential needs. This approach allowed them to avoid incurring food expenses, with their primary financial obligations limited to the mortgage and utility bills for the house. In essence, the couple was running a foster home as a profitable business venture. The foster parents viewed the children in their care as sources of income rather than as children in need. Consequently, there was a lack of a personal connection with them, which led to the formation of stronger bonds amongst the children themselves. Given that all the other children were younger than me, they naturally looked up to me and I assumed a mentorship role. I provided guidance and support to the other children in various ways, including assisting with cooking and ensuring that everyone fulfilled their assigned chores. Despite the unorthodox arrangement and the couple's business activities, we managed to establish a makeshift family. By adopting an oriented approach, we were able to establish a makeshift family among ourselves. In the absence of strong connections with our foster parents, we discovered support and camaraderie within our own group. As we continued to visit the local soup kitchen, I had the opportunity to meet a woman named Mrs. Carroll. At that time, she was 36 years old and frequently volunteered there alongside her husband James, who happened to be a local pastor. James was 42 years old, and their 2 children were a 5-year-old boy and a 7-year-old girl. The gentleman in question would accompany her on these occasions, through these weekly encounters at the soup kitchen. I was afforded the opportunity to become better acquainted with Mrs. Carroll. We would exchange pleasantries and she came across as friendly and approachable. On a particular day, while she was performing her usual duties of serving meals, she encouraged me to consider volunteering earlier. She mentioned that they occasionally faced challenges in finding enough volunteers. I readily agreed to volunteer and assured her that I would arrive early for the next opportunity. Staying true to my word, I showed up promptly for the next volunteering session, even bringing along my foster brothers to assist. Our presence proved to be more than sufficient. It was sufficient to help with their needs, and we eagerly contributed by serving meals and assisting with the subsequent clean-up. Being part of something positive was a rewarding experience, especially considering the difficulties we encountered in our foster home. Mrs. Carroll's kindness and the chance to give back to the community introduced a new dimension to my life. Mrs. Carroll's kindness was a significant factor in my life. She consistently wore a warm smile, and I valued the positive atmosphere she brought to our interactions. It was not until one day after we had finished serving meals that I discovered her husband, James, was a pastor. She extended an invitation to me and my brothers to attend one of their church services. At that point, I hesitated to accept the invitation to attend a church service, as I lacked any personal connection to religion and had never set foot in a church before. Nevertheless, I held a favorable opinion of Pentecostal churchgoers because they had consistently extended a helping hand to me throughout my life. Despite this, I remained uncertain about attending the service. In response to Mrs. Carroll's repeated invitations, I was eventually afforded the opportunity to meet James, her husband. He appeared to take a liking to me, recognizing and appreciating my efforts in cleaning up the kitchen. My energy and friendly demeanor earned his approval, although he was otherwise occupied due to pastoral duties. Pastoral duties prevented him from volunteering on a regular basis, despite my initial reservations about attending their church. However, my experiences with Mrs. Carroll and James began to alter my perspective, and their kindness made me consider giving it a chance. Eventually, I made the decision to attend the church with 2 of my brothers, who my 2 brothers and I were somewhat out of place, dressed in our casual attire rather than the typical church garments at that time. The church was not overly large, boasting a congregation of around 400 to 600 members. However, it was sizable enough that we couldn't help but feel like conspicuous newcomers during the church service. Mrs. Carroll was not visible until the conclusion of the service, which took place in a church with a seating capacity of approximately 400. She was seated near the pulpit, alongside her husband, Pastor James, and some church elders. Mrs. Carroll held the role of the primary church singer and demonstrated exceptional talent in that regard. Following the service, I took the initiative to approach her and exchange greetings. She displayed genuine delight upon seeing me. Although our interaction was brief, as she promptly shifted her focus to other congregation members in the subsequent weeks, my thoughts often gravitated towards Mrs. Carroll. Her consistent kindness to my brothers and me left a lasting impression, and I eagerly anticipated any opportunity to encounter her during our volunteer sessions at the soup kitchen. During my frequent visits to the soup kitchen, I often inquired if she required any assistance, hoping to engage in more conversations with her. Her presence had a captivating quality that left me feeling that our connection was evolving beyond the occasional greetings we exchanged at the soup kitchen. One day, Mrs. Carroll confided in me about her recent experiences. Unfortunately, the movers had overlooked some items and she found herself in need of assistance. As her husband, Pastor James, was occupied with his pastoral duties, she wondered if I could offer a helping hand. I readily agreed to help following the closure of the soup kitchen. One of my brothers and I accompanied Mrs. Carroll, and her children were transported to their new residence, conveniently located in close proximity to the soup kitchen. During the journey, we engaged in conversation, during which I shared my life story as a foster child with no knowledge of my biological parents. Mrs. Carroll expressed empathy for my circumstances and inquired about my aspirations. I revealed my dream of recounted my previous involvement with friends in learning to play musical instruments, which had faded due to my lack of a cell phone or internet access. Sharing my dreams and challenges with Mrs. Carroll felt oddly comforting. She attentively listened, and her genuine concern fostered a connection that I had never experienced before. Following our assistance with the move, Mrs. Carroll took me to Walmart and purchased a Nokia cell phone for me. It was a prepaid phone that allowed calls, text messaging, and even internet browsing. I was gratified by this gesture, as it was akin to getting my first car and opened up a whole new world of possibilities. I proceeded to add contacts to my new phone, including some friends. However, the person I found myself frequently texting was Mrs. Carroll. This occurred during a time when taking and sharing photos was a novel concept, since platforms like Instagram did not yet exist. She would send me snapshots of her daily outfits or her attire before heading to the gym. I would frequently go above and beyond in expressing my admiration for her, showering her with an abundance of compliments about her cuteness and beauty. The interactions remained wholesome, although I may have occasionally overindulged in my compliments. Mrs. Carroll appeared to derive enjoyment from our exchanges, often responding with new pictures, sometimes even twice a day. These exchanges gradually evolved into a daily routine. Despite the absence of any inappropriate content, as I continued to send compliments and receive her pictures, my feelings for her began to deepen unexpectedly. This was despite the innocuous nature of our conversations. A connection was forming between us over time. What began as the exchange of daily outfit pictures with Mrs. Carroll took on a special significance. It felt as though she was confiding something personal exclusively with me, even though it revolved around her everyday clothing choices. Our regular texting continued, and my affection for her grew, particularly when we encountered each other during our volunteer work at the soup kitchen. Texting became our preferred mode of communication, and after each volunteering session, during the course of our sessions, Mrs. Carroll began to share innocent hugs with me. These embraces remained entirely pure and devoid of any romantic intent. They became the highlight of my day. The lingering fragrance of her perfume left a lasting impression, and I cherished this small yet meaningful connection. My thoughts began to revolve around her constantly, and I found myself developing a crush on her. In order to increase the frequency of my encounters with her, I decided to invest the money I had saved in purchasing a jacket. as volunteering events alone were no longer sufficient to see her. One day, she sent me a picture. I chose to convey something I hadn't expressed before, labeling the image as attractive. Ordinarily, after complimenting her, she would respond with gratitude. However, on this occasion, there was an unsettling silence that made me anxious, fearing I had made a mistake to exacerbate matters. She refrained from sending any more pictures for 2 days, seemingly confirming my apprehensions about crossing a boundary. I was concerned about crossing a boundary and feeling uneasy about my earlier comment. I decided to offer a personal apology to Mrs. Carroll when I encountered her at the soup kitchen the following week in a moment of privacy away from the ears of others. I sincerely expressed regret for my previous statement. To my relief, she appeared unaffected and regarded me as if I were overreacting. She asserted her comfort with the remark, though her body language suggested otherwise. Her demeanor towards me wasn't as warm as it had been previously. On the following day, she shared another picture of herself. I distinctly remember texting her, "You are incredibly attractive. I wish you were mine once again." She refrained from offering thanks, but continued to send additional pictures on this occasion. Her attire seemed somewhat more revealing than usual, suggesting it was unlikely she would wear such an outfit in public. I complimented her on her appealing appearance, and from that moment on, the pictures she shared gradually became more alluring. However, they never fully disclosed too much or involved nudity, always leaving a lot to the imagination. It became evident that she relished the attention and admiration directed her way. Since I regularly encountered her children at the soup kitchen, we formed a close bond. I spent a lot of time playing with them, getting to know them well. On one occasion, she requested if I could babysit her kids while she and her husband had to attend an event. I agreed, and we engaged in enjoyable games of hide and seek. I engaged in activities with her children and, upon her return, she compensated me. This was significant to me because I was unemployed at the time. I promptly used the money to purchase clothing that better suited my taste, as the ones provided by my foster parents did not align with my preferences. We grew closer, and on occasion, she would send me playful and flirtatious pictures that hinted at something more. I would express my desires, sharing my wish that she were mine and detailing what I envisioned. However, she never replied with words, and we never broached the subject in our conversations. This remained an unspoken aspect of our text messages. During one of my babysitting sessions after her return home, we engaged in a game of hide-and-seek. I sought with her children, as the youngest child was tasked with finding everyone. I concealed myself behind the closet door in the darkness, unsure if she could not find a hiding spot or simply wanted to join me. Mrs. Carroll decided to share my hiding place with her, back pressed against me. We stood there, unable to ignore the situation. The romantic tension that had been building for months was finally released in a physical encounter. My desire for physical contact with her grew, and I initiated it. She eventually turned around and we passionately kissed and explored each other's desires. Our interlude concluded abruptly when her children called out to us. On my return home, I experienced a profound sense of happiness as I reflected on the cherished memories of our time together. Subsequently, she ceased sending me pictures and I refrained from texting her until she requested my babysitting assistance the following week. Upon her return, she treated her children to pizza while they dined. We then retired to the bedroom and engaged in an intimate encounter, which marked my inaugural sexual experience. From that point onwards, she initiated contact via text and I would promptly ride to her residence, even in the absence of babysitting duties. Behind closed doors, we shared intimate moments, occasionally remaining in bed. In the course of our conversation, she implored me to maintain discretion, urging me not to disclose our relationship to my friends, siblings, or anyone else. A profound connection between us was established, and she revealed that her husband adhered to strict preferences in the bedroom, favoring only missionary positions. Given the demands of his role, our intimacy occurred at a minimum of 3 instances each week. Despite the potential for guilt, I remained apathetic to the moral implications. My preoccupation with her reached a point where I believed I was in love. At this juncture, I yearned to linger in her embrace all night, engaged in conversation instead of returning home. Unfortunately, I had to depart when her husband was due to return. Our encounters gradually became less frequent, occurring approximately twice a week. Fast forward about a year later, I had secured a job as a cashier, and the babysitting responsibilities diminished in both frequency and duration. Throughout our liaisons, she had never broached the topic of using protection. One fateful day, during an intimate moment, our lapse in locking the door led to her son inadvertently walking in on us, catching us red-handed. It was unclear whether he was aware of his surroundings, although he appeared to be a discerning child. We were left in uncertainty about the duration of his presence, prompting us to hastily cover ourselves. She anxiously urged me to leave, her demeanor displaying a clear sense of panic. This incident marked the first time we were caught, and it happened. Approximately 1 year into our clandestine relationship, she began distancing herself. The exchange of pictures and invitations ceased. My attempts to reach her at the soup kitchen were met with a declaration that we should terminate our involvement. I was unable to move on, persistently texting her and appearing at the soup kitchen. Subsequently, she ceased attending altogether, leaving me with a profound sense of abandonment and emotional turmoil for days. I grieved in secret, tears silently streaming down my cheeks regarding the pictures she had sent me. I was convinced that I was in love. A week after our parting, I decided to visit her church. I was longing for even the briefest glimpse of her. This was approximately a month following our breakup. I was surprised to learn that she was pregnant at that juncture. I did not consider the possibility that I might be the father. Instead, I experienced a sense of relief, believing that her absence was due to the pregnancy rather than her abandoning me like others. Upon returning home, I concentrated on my studies and work. Upon graduating from high school, I left the foster home to enlist in the Navy. During my tenure in the Navy, around 2005, I began to consider the possibility of being the father of her child. However, I lacked the resources to investigate further. I deduced that her husband was unlikely to be the father, as she had indicated that their intimacy was limited and that I had shared more intimate moments with her than her husband had. As a result, my thoughts of her gradually receded as I embarked on world travels and engaged in relationships with various women. It was unlikely that her husband was the father, given that she had indicated that their intimacy was limited. Indeed, she had even stated that I had shared more intimate moments with her than her husband had. As a result of my military service, my thoughts of her gradually receded as I embarked on world travels and engaged in relationships with various women. Ultimately, I subsequently married a Japanese woman and relocated her to the United States. Once my business had become established, I sought her out on Facebook and discovered that she remained married to her husband and was still actively engaged in church activities. Furthermore, her congregation had expanded. She is now the mother of 4 children. When I examined the features of the third child, I could not help but detect a resemblance to my own. However, I have no intention of disrupting their lives by divulging this information, as doing so could potentially devastate not only her life but mine as well. It feels like one of those secrets that will remain buried with me. 8 months ago, I married a Japanese woman and relocated her to the United States. Once my business had become established, I sought her out on Facebook and discovered that she remained married to her husband and was still actively engaged in church activities. Furthermore, her congregation had expanded. She is now the mother of 4 children. When I examined the features of the third child, I could not help but detect a resemblance to my own. However, I have no intention of disrupting their lives by divulging this information, as doing so could potentially devastate not only the child in question bears a striking resemblance to my own. However, I am disinclined to divulge this information, as doing so could potentially have a detrimental impact on both her and my life. It seems that this is a secret that will remain buried with me. What advice would you give me in this situation? My wife and I married 8 months ago, and now we have a 19-month-old son. Our story began in 2020. When we first met and began dating casually, we proceeded at a leisurely pace and remained friends for several months before our relationship progressed to a more serious level. The lockdown period undoubtedly had an impact on our early relationship, as we were only able to meet on a few occasions. However, as soon as the restrictions were lifted, our bond strengthened considerably, leading to a close relationship. A few months later, she informed me that she was pregnant. This was an unexpected turn of events. Just a few months into our relationship, this was a significant cause for concern and will become apparent why this news came as a complete shock and I was not prepared for it. Despite using protection on most occasions, there were a few instances when I did not. During those times, she encouraged me and assured me it was safe based on her cycle. However, it is not advisable to rely solely on a woman for birth control, and the rhythm method should not be trusted. This woman taught me an important lesson: never assume anything when it comes to pregnancy. Despite my initial apprehensions, I was looking forward to becoming a father. She moved in with me, and I accompanied her to most of her doctor appointments. When the baby was born, we gave him my first and last name, even though we weren't married at the time. After living together for just under a year, I proposed and we got married a month later. The wedding was low-key. With only close family and a few friends in attendance. We were deeply in love and crazy about our son. After my wife's maternity leave, she returned to work, and my mother began caring for our son. Since I had a later start time at work, I usually dropped off the baby in the morning, and my wife picked him up after work. We often ended up having dinner with my parents because my mother is an avid cook. Life seemed ideal, but circumstances changed on Veterans Day. It was a company holiday and we both had the day off. My wife and mother went shopping while I stayed home with the baby. While putting him down for a nap, I noticed her tablet on the dresser and decided to search for something on Google. I had never used her tablet before, but she used the same password was used for all accounts, so I was able to access them without any issues. I did not hesitate to use her tablet since we openly shared each other's phones and our home computer. After my search, I decided to check Twitter and Facebook to catch up on the latest news while waiting for my son to fall asleep. Instead of logging into my accounts, I simply utilized her account since she was already logged in while browsing Facebook. I became curious and decided to discreetly peruse my wife's messages. I was not seeking any trouble, I merely wished to ascertain the nature of her recent communications. It was a relatively innocuous act of espionage. Her recent messages were, for the most part, mundane, consisting of brief exchanges with me, her friends, family, and a few colleagues. The messages were not deleted, so there were thousands of them dating back to when she first joined the platform. My curiosity led me to backtrack to when we first connected, hoping to find the very first message she sent me. I was also interested in seeing what she was sharing with her friends about me during those early days. It did not take long to find those messages, which brought back some memories. I continued reading, amused by her observations about me. However, I soon encountered a peculiar conversation between her and a Facebook user whose name I did not recognize. As I read their exchanges, I pieced together the identity of this person. It turned out that he was a colleague at her workplace. He was not just any colleague, but a senior manager, and she worked under him and two other managers in an administrative role. What prompted suspicion was that he was using a fictitious account to communicate with her, despite the fact that I had not personally known him. I had met him and his wife at company events, such as Christmas parties and picnics. His wife even held our son at the last company picnic. I was unaware that this seemingly innocuous act would soon reveal a dark secret about my wife. As I delved deeper into their messages, I was struck by a devastating realization. It became evident that my wife had been engaged in a physical relationship with this individual for a considerable period of time. Based on the evidence I had gathered, it appeared that the affair had commenced several months prior to our meeting and continued for a similar duration afterwards. The emotional impact of this realization was overwhelming, prompting me to shed tears while seated beside my son's crib. However, the most distressing information was yet to emerge. As I continued reading, I came across a series of messages in which the discussion then turned to the topic of her pregnancy. Upon reading a message in which he inquired as to the paternity of the child, she replied that she was unsure. This revelation caused me to experience a profound sense of distress, akin to a physical blow. The notion that my son might not be biologically mine was simply unfathomable. I was rendered speechless and felt an overwhelming urge to lash out in anger. In his subsequent message, he proposed that she consider terminating the pregnancy. In order to mitigate any potential risks, he informed her that the company's insurance would cover the costs and that I would never have to find out. My wife responded, stating that she was unable to proceed with the suggestion. He followed up with a somewhat ominous remark, stating that it was her decision, but that he did not want any future difficulties if the child was proven to be his. He made it clear that he had no intention of divorcing his wife and warned her against taking such a course of action. She did not respond, which marked the end of their communication. No further messages were exchanged between them. These messages date back to 2020, with the last one being over 2 years ago. Right before she revealed she was pregnant, it became evident that she had trapped me with a child that might not even be mine. This is the cold, hard truth of the matter. It seems that she was head over heels for her boss and possibly intentionally got pregnant, with the intention of tying him to her and persuading him to leave his wife. However, it is evident that he was not prepared to accept this plan, and when she realized that her dream guy was not interested, she decided to cling to the nice guy she had been dating. I suspect that this is what went down. I felt like a complete fool. I am not entirely sure why she did not delete the messages. I was disconcerted by the messages, but I was relieved that she did not act upon them. Perhaps she had a devious plan to use them against him at a later date. I was consumed by a range of emotions, from deep sadness to intense anger, as I contemplated the impact of her actions on our family. I considered confronting her with my mother present as soon as they returned, but then I thought it might be better to have all the facts before doing so. When they eventually returned, I decided to wait until I had gathered my thoughts and was in a better position to respond. I attempted to maintain a normal demeanor, but my mother discerned that something was amiss. She inquired if I was coming down with something. I assured her that I was not, merely experiencing fatigue from chasing after our energetic child all day. She chuckled and mentioned how exhausting he could be. I was inclined to believe her, as I found it challenging to concentrate at work the following day. My mind was preoccupied with the tasks at hand. The most pressing matter on my agenda was to obtain a DNA test. Consequently, I scheduled an appointment for the following week. On the appointed day, I took some time off and proceeded to my parents' residence to collect my son. My mother seemed somewhat surprised to see me. I informed her that I had a few errands to run for work and that my son would enjoy a car ride. My mother is quite adept at detecting falsehoods, but she accepted my explanation and we set off. Over the following days, I was in a state of distress, eagerly awaiting the results of the DNA test. The day the results were received was the most distressing day of my life, even more so than the day I discovered her infidelity. I will never forget the overwhelming feeling that washed over me when I opened the report and saw the negative results. It was as if a dagger had pierced straight through my chest, and I felt like I had been dealt a blow by the devil himself. The rest of that day was a blur, my thoughts racing in a million different directions. I immediately knew I couldn't continue being married to her after what she had done. However, I grappled with what to do about my son. I loved him just as much as before, but I had to admit that knowing he wasn't biologically mine started to change how I saw him. I didn't treat him any differently, but it altered my perspective. I didn't feel comfortable sharing my thoughts were in a state of rapid and chaotic movement, encompassing a multitude of disparate ideas. It became immediately apparent that my continued marriage to her was untenable in light of her actions. However, I found myself grappling with the question of how to proceed with regard to my son. My feelings towards him remained unchanged, yet I was forced to acknowledge that his status as a non-biological child had altered my perception of him. This shift in perspective did not prompt any immediate changes in my behavior towards him. I was confronted with a dilemma that I was unable to discuss with anyone, and thus I had to sort through my feelings on my own. I decided it was crucial to take some time to ponder everything thoroughly before making a decision. I maintained the facade of acting normally, but with each passing day it became increasingly challenging. Eventually, I came to the conclusion that the best course of action for both my son and me would be for me to step away. I realize that letting him go is an extremely painful decision, but I am convinced that it is the correct one. Despite my love for my son, I believe that our relationship will never be the same, particularly once I divorce his mother. To illustrate this point, it is likely that both my soon-to-be ex-wife and I will form new relationships and potentially have more children in the future. Consequently, my son would have 3 fathers in his life to consider. The biological father, the stepfather, and then the individual who was deceived into marrying the mother. It is possible to envisage the complications that would arise for the child and all those involved if the mother were to step away from the situation at this point in time. There is a possibility that the child might forget about the individual in question in a few months' time. Therefore, it would be beneficial for all concerned if the mother were to step away from the situation at this point in time. After numerous sleepless nights, the mother consulted with an attorney and set things in motion. The attorney explained that since the marriage had been given that the marriage had lasted for less than a year and had been based on deception, I was advised that I could pursue an annulment. This would result in the marriage being treated as if it had never occurred. This appeared to be the most favorable option in terms of my son's future. The attorney informed me that, based on the evidence I had provided, there was a high probability of success in my case. However, he inquired as to whether this was truly what I wanted. I replied in the affirmative. Affirmatively, yet the emotional distress I was experiencing caused me to become overwhelmed with emotion. He was aware of the emotional turmoil I was going through and suggested I return home and rest for a further night before making a final decision. He emphasized that while the legal route could provide closure, it could also result in my son being entirely removed from my life. He shared stories of other men he had represented in similar situations. Noting that many struggled with the emotional aftermath because they were not mentally prepared for it, I thanked him and left feeling completely drained emotionally. I drove around aimlessly trying to make sense of everything and then eventually returned home to spend the evening playing with my son. When he finally dozed off in my arms, I carefully placed him in his crib as I watched him sleeping peacefully. Tears welled up and I was unable to contain my emotions. Fortunately, my wife did not hear my tears. Later, she came looking for me and found me lying on top of our bed. I pretended to be asleep, and she gave me a gentle kiss on the lips. Unaware of the turmoil within me, she kissed me. While she kissed me, I thought, "You deceitful woman. You're acting as if everything is fine. You've done nothing wrong that night." I tossed and turned, getting barely an hour of sleep. My thoughts were dominated by concerns about my son and my decision to divorce. I considered whether, in 20 years, any of this would matter, and whether I would regret my choices on my deathbed. Ultimately, I resolved to stick with my original plan. The following morning, I called my attorney and informed him that I wanted to proceed with the divorce and paternity filings. He assured me that he would start working on it, but he mentioned that it might take a couple of weeks to get everything in order. In the meantime, he advised me to continue living in our home and maintain a facade of normality until the paperwork was ready. A few days have passed since then, and I've been struggling immensely. The thought of walking away from my son tears me apart. I dread that day, but at the same time, I can't wait to put this chapter of my life behind me. Update: 3 weeks. A period of approximately 3 weeks has elapsed since the last update. I am currently situated in a location where the sun is setting, and I am reflecting on my life. I believe it would be beneficial to share what has transpired in the intervening period. Approximately 1 week after my previous update, my attorney completed all the necessary paperwork for my divorce and paternity filings. Everything was prepared, and it was time to implement my plan of action. My first step was to have a heart-to-heart conversation with my son. To this end, I have been engaged in the following activities. I had a heart-to-heart conversation with my parents. To say that they were devastated would be an understatement. They were both deeply affected, especially my mother, who has been a significant part of my son's life. While they expressed their full support, my mother did ask if there was any way I could find it in my heart to continue being a part of my son's life. I told her that I would love to, but that the situation had become too complicated. I reiterated the reasons I mentioned in my original post, and my parents respected my decision. It is reassuring to have their support. Despite this, they had some initial reservations. It was evident that the couple understood the necessity of this course of action, which would be beneficial for all parties involved. I informed them that I would be relocating all my personal belongings to their house and would be staying with them until I found a new place to live. I also shared my plan to confront my wife at our apartment when she returned that evening. I wanted both of my parents to be present to ensure that the situation did not escalate and to care for the baby during the confrontation. I did not beat around the bush. I confronted her directly about her affair with her boss, which left her stunned and in tears. I began to explain, assuring her that she would have sufficient time to speak. However, I had more to say, so I handed her the DNA test results, which revealed that I was not the biological father of our son. Her reaction was intense. She screamed no and buried her face in a cushion, crying. I permitted her to weep without uttering a word for what seemed an interminable period. Eventually, she arose from her seated position and expressed her apologies, reiterating that I was our son's sole biological father. I corrected her assertion, stating that I was not the child's biological father. She then pleaded with me not to say that, and at that moment, I handed her a folder containing the divorce papers. She agreed to the terms of the agreement and petitioned to disestablish paternity. Her emotional response was evident as she threw the folder on the floor and continued crying. She pleaded with me not to leave them and asked for a chance to explain. I informed her that the floor was hers and that I was willing to listen instead of engaging in conversation. She excused herself and headed to the bathroom to grab a tissue. She spent approximately 15 minutes in there before I became concerned and decided to check on her. She assured me that she would be out shortly, but it took another 10 minutes before she finally emerged. This is another example of the individual in question was initially caught off guard and required time to formulate an appropriate response. Upon finally emerging, she was no longer in tears, but rather expressed deep remorse and acknowledged the unfortunate nature of the affair. She claimed that she ended the affair around the time we became serious, although there was some overlap. She maintained that she had been completely faithful to me ever since, including throughout our marriage. I informed her that I believed her, but this did not negate the fact that she had cheated and that the child was not biologically mine. She subsequently acknowledged that she was uncertain about my paternity at the time, but expressed a strong conviction that I was the father. She attempted to redirect the conversation, stating that the biological aspect was irrelevant. She argued that our son loved me more than anyone else and implored me not to abandon him. It was evident that she was attempting to manipulate me into remaining. I had anticipated this and remained firm, despite her tears and pleading. She was emotionally distressed, and my mother subsequently spent the next 3 nights with her and the infant until her own mother arrived. I also experienced emotional distress. I was emotionally drained and required a period of respite from the situation. I took time off from work and chose to come here despite my parents' objections. They were concerned about my fragile mental state, but I assured them I would be fine. Being away has helped me to clear my mind. My soon-to-be ex, she has been contacting me via telephone and text message, but I have not engaged in conversation. I have replied to a few of her texts and she has been pleading with me to stay. While I do feel some sadness for her, I have remained firm in my decision not to waver. Currently, both of my legal cases have been filed. I am awaiting a court date. While I do feel a sense of relief, I am acutely aware of the pain I am experiencing due to the absence of my son. However, with each passing day, I am gradually becoming more comfortable. I wanted to take this opportunity to briefly address a question I have been receiving. I have been asked to provide an explanation of my decision to relocate to this area. I required a period of respite from my previous circumstances, and this location offers a unique opportunity to observe the evolution of Bitcoin as the first country to recognize it as a legal tender. I first became involved with Bitcoin in 2012, purchasing a small quantity at a cost of less than $110 each. I subsequently sold the majority of these holdings in 2017 when the value reached $4. I sold 200 units, which enabled me to discharge my student loans, credit card bills, and even to repay my parents' house. I also purchased a couple of new vehicles and invested a significant amount in mutual funds. I took a year-long break from school to explore Europe. Consequently, I made a considerable sum of money from this move. However, the price of Bitcoin soared to over $42. Recently, the value of Bitcoin reached $42,000. If I had retained my holdings for a few more years, I would have amassed a considerable fortune. At the time, I considered myself to be an expert in finance. However, upon reflection, I feel that I could have benefited from a more patient approach. While I have achieved a certain degree of success, I still have a few Bitcoins remaining. While this may not be sufficient to enable me to retire permanently, it has provided me with a modest income. I am pleased to report that, 10 months later, the government and paternity challenge cases have been concluded and I have fulfilled all my marital obligations. I have commenced a new position that requires me to divide my time between the United States and El Salvador. During a recent visit to El Salvador, I developed a strong affinity for the country. It was during this trip that I had an unplanned encounter with the CEO of a blockchain company while relaxing at a beach bar. Our initial conversation developed into a lengthy discussion, and the following day, he extended an invitation to tour their office during my scheduled visit. I had the opportunity to interact with some of their employees and engage in conversation with their HR manager. In summary, they offered me a position on the spot. However, I did not accept the offer immediately. Due to my personal circumstances and some uncertainty about living in a foreign country, in addition to the fact that I still had my previous position back home, the CEO was understanding and informed me that they would be open to me working remotely from the United States, provided that I spent a few weeks in El Salvador every quarter. He advised me to return home, consider the offer, and contact him in a few days. Once I got back home, I had a change of heart. I discussed the matter with my parents, who expressed support for my decision, although they had concerns about me working abroad. There was also the worry that I might be avoiding my problems, but I assured them that was not the case. Ultimately, I made the decision to accept the position 5 months ago, and I am now thoroughly enjoying it. I have returned to El Salvador, and, with each visit, I feel increasingly connected to the place. Indeed, I am seriously considering making it my primary residence, particularly given the current political and social unrest in the United States. The people of El Salvador are notably positive and forward-thinking. In retrospect, my wife made considerable efforts to alter my perspective prior to my divorce. I am convinced that she genuinely loved me and was sincere in her intentions. However, the damage caused by our relationship was too profound to be rectified. Interestingly, after I commenced my new role, the intense animosity I held towards her appeared to dissipate. She was aware of this and seemed to be more distressed by it than when I was angry with her. She could discern that I had moved on. As for her son, that has been the most challenging aspect, but even that the outcome was satisfactory. My mother continues to provide care for him, and I have visited on several occasions to have lunch with him when he has been there. However, he must exercise caution in maintaining this connection, as his mother and my parents are very fond of the child. Maintaining this connection can be challenging. On my first visit after several months, his eyes lit up and he gave me a big kiss and hug. He still remembers me, but I believe he sees me now as just a nice guy and not his father. He is an incredible child, and I will always cherish the memories we have shared.